They seemed like picture-perfect high school sweethearts, but the toxic relationship ended in murder.
All the way back to November 21st, 2016. Around 6 a.m. on that Monday morning, Jill Walker poked her head into her 16-year-old daughter Emma's bedroom. Her room looked like it always did. Messy, cluttered, pictures on the wall, clothes on the floor. Nothing looked out of the ordinary. But when she walked over to the bed to wake her up, she didn't move. She called her name, nothing. She shook her, nothing. So she checked for a pulse, nothing. That's when she made a frantic call to 911. First responders say the call came in as a possible suicide, maybe a drug overdose, because it just didn't look like anything violent had happened. In fact, she looked like she was sleeping. But when investigators got to the house, they followed standard procedure. Photograph the scene, start from the sidewalk, all the way into the bedroom. And that is the first time they saw it. Right through the lens of the camera. A tiny bullet hole, no bigger than a pin, in her wall. And when they moved her head, they found a little blood and another bullet hole through her pillow. And just above her ear, along her hairline, they found the bullet hole that killed her instantly. When they went outside, they found 2 bullet holes in the house, outside her bedroom, and 2 shell casings on the ground below. But who would want to kill the popular cheerleader? To answer that question, investigators started picking apart her life, and what they found was disturbing and frightening. At first glance, Emma was your typical all-American teen, sweet, pretty, popular. From the outside looking in, her life as a high school junior could have been lifted straight out of a photo spread in 17 magazine. She spent her Friday nights on the field, under the lights, cheering on her school's football team. She volunteered at an animal shelter. She was an honor roll student. She dreamed of becoming a neonatal nurse. It all looked so promising. Her future looked golden. But this isn't that kind of story. Sometimes fate twists and turns into a dangerous spiral that ends with sorrow, and you don't know where it even started. But in this case, we know exactly where her bright future turned dark. 2 years before she was killed, in 2014, when she was a 14-year-old freshman, new to Central High School, and a fresh recruit to the cheerleading squad. That is when her bright smile caught the eye of a popular football player, 16-year-old William Riley Gall, and she was crushing on him right back. So Riley wasn't your stereotypical high school jock. Yeah, he was a football player, but he was also kind of this adorable nerd with a goofy sense of humor and a passion for Star Wars. Charming. That's the word that keeps coming up about him. He was just so charming. You couldn't help but like him. At first. When Emma first locked eyes with him, he already had a girlfriend, but it didn't take long for him to break things off with her so he could be with Emma. Well, he didn't exactly break things off the way that you might expect, because even though he was bombarding Emma with these loving messages and gifts, he was also planning on taking his supposed ex to their junior prom. It made 0 sense. He told her it was this promise he made when he broke things off. He would take Emma to a senior prom. In reality, it was more of a ploy than a promise, a ploy to manipulate Emma's emotions, and it was the beginning of a horrifying pattern. Over the next 2 years, Riley and Emma morphed from this picture-perfect loving twosome into that couple. You know the kind, the one that's always on some kind of dramatic high or low. They're breaking up, they're back on. You know what I mean. Every friend group has at least one of these couples, but not as bad as this. At least I hope not. He would text Emma horrible things like, "I've never hated anyone as much as you." And then the next day he'd beg her forgiveness. He controlled what she wore, how she did her hair and makeup. He told her she looked awful or pretty depending on his mood. Her parents felt helpless while they watched this happen to their daughter. They tried talking to her, but Riley was in her ear, driving a wedge between her and her friends and family. He was isolating her from the people that loved her. And when they weren't together, he constantly messaged her. Her friend said he would sometimes text her anywhere from 30 to 100 times a night if she was hanging out with them alone. He called her constantly, phone call after phone call, trying to make her feel guilty for being without him and making sure she wasn't doing anything he wouldn't approve of. Now, when it came to her family, he was good at dripping poison into her ear about them, too. He did his best to convince her that he was the only one that really loved her. Her parents didn't understand her. Her brother didn't care about her. They weren't a real family. Only the two of them mattered. Only the family they would make in the future was real. But when her parents found the horrifying text from him saying, "You're dead to me. I'll check the obituary. You," they put their foot down, and they made it clear he was no longer welcome in their house or with their daughter. Now, if you have teenage kids or, if you've ever been a teenager, you know exactly how well that worked. The more they tried to separate them, the more she wanted to be with him. They took her phone away. He gave her a new one. And he just kept showing up at their church, at football games, basketball games. He even took to waiting for her outside the grocery store where she worked. Sometimes he'd stand out there texting her and waiting for her for hours. But these are public places. He wasn't doing anything illegal necessarily. How could they make him leave? By the fall of 2016, Riley had graduated and started college. He and Emma weren't in the same school every day. Now, her friends and family hoped that their terrible, awful relationship had run its course, especially now that he wasn't going to be in her face every second, but it just got worse. He enrolled at Maryville College, just 20 miles away. At first, they had no plans to break up. He certainly wasn't about to release his hold on her. And her parents were grasping for some way to get their cheerful, happy daughter back. At the end of October, they grounded her. It was all they had left. The only places she was allowed to go was school, cheerleading practice, and straight home. Maybe it was the few weeks that they were forced apart that did it. Or maybe it was the first-hand look she got at the girls he was spending time with on campus, thanks to Instagram and Snapchat. But whatever it was, she seemed to be returning to her old self again. And finally, she told him it was over. And this time, she meant it. So Riley did not take the breakup well. He talked endlessly about Emma. There was a suicide attempt with a bottle of Vicodin. He was unraveling. 18 days slipped by. It was the longest she'd gone without him since her freshman year. Cautiously, the people around her started to relax. It looked like the Riley drama might actually be well and truly over. Her parents were so relieved they even eased up on her curfew, and she was allowed to go to a friend's house for a party after a game on Friday, November 18th, 2016. She's having fun celebrating their football team's victory when, out of nowhere, she gets a text from this unknown number. The first text, first of many, says, "Come outside alone if you don't want to see a loved one get hurt." The next one told her to get her keys and go to her car alone. And then they kept coming more and more, and the threats got worse and worse. They were saying things like, "We have Riley. Call him if you want to hear his crying and screams." This kind of thing. So when her phone rang, she heard what sounded like someone being tortured on the other end. So she's panicking. She didn't know what to do. Was this real? Was this a prank? Finally, she got one last text telling her Riley had been dumped outside. So she and her friends rushed out of the house party, not knowing if they should expect to see his body, his attackers, both. But what they found was stranger than they would have imagined. There was Riley, lying face down in a ditch outside. When they reached him, he woke up and struggled to stand. He looked disoriented. He was acting confused about where he was, why he was there. He claimed he'd been kidnapped, but he refused to let them call the police. And no one was buying it. Emma started screaming at him. She was angry at this silly, far-fetched ruse. Why would someone fake a kidnapping? Why would anyone pull a stupid prank like that? If she hadn't been done with him before, she was definitely over him now. She and her friends went back to the party. She tried her best to shrug it off and continue on with her night. But Riley didn't let it go. He even called his friend Noah to try and convince him it was real. He swore he'd really been kidnapped. And he told him he got his grandfather's gun for protection. Now, the next morning, Emma drove herself home from her friend's house. As she was driving down her street, she noticed someone dressed all in black walking down the sidewalk toward her house. When she passed by in her car, this person, whoever it was, she didn't recognize him. He put on sunglasses and he cinched the hood of his sweater tight so, nobody could see his face. Her neighborhood was quiet and safe. Whoever this was, he stuck out like a sore thumb. But she kept an eye on him and rushed inside as soon as she pulled up to her house. But that is when the terror started. When the door shut behind her, this person, started banging on it, turning the knob, trying to get in. She's looking at the window, but she can't see his face, and no one was home. So imagine it. After that bizarre kidnapping thing the night before, she didn't know what to think. Had Riley been telling the truth all along? Was she in danger too? So she texted him. Here's what she said. "I'm so angry at you, but I need you right now." And of course, he told her he'd be right there. He was speeding over. So, he shows up like moments later because, of course, he had been right outside. And he searched the house inside and out to make sure this stranger hadn't broken in somehow. But while he was on his way out, her mother pulled up. And imagine how stunned and sickened she must have been to see him standing there with her daughter again after she thought she was rid of this guy. So she tells him to leave. Tells him he's not allowed to be there, but he assured her he was just there to protect Emma. Well, she didn't believe a word that he said, and later she tried to convince Emma that it was probably Riley all along. But her daughter wasn't ready to believe he could do something so horrible just to scare her and then save her. And tragically, her kind heart didn't let her see the truth about her first love. And the next night, she was shot and killed as she lay sleeping. After the murder, Riley's name kept coming up. His obsessive, psychotic behavior wasn't a secret. Everyone knew. But when they questioned him that same day, he said he was miles away on campus Sunday night. He claimed he borrowed a friend's phone to call her that night, but she was mean to him and hung up and blocked the number. So he figured that was it. He spent the night crying in his car in the parking lot of the university. But the detectives told 2020 later the whole story sounded rehearsed. His denials then started to take on a strange distance. He started referring to her as the girl, saying things like, "The girl, she texted me." So they're like, which girl? And he says, "The one that passed away. I hope you don't think I had anything to do with her death. I wouldn't hurt that girl." I mean, the way he kept calling her the girl, it's weird for someone who had been obsessed and in love with her. They wondered, why is he calling her that? So later that day, they got their answer, thanks to Riley's friends. The day they found out Emma had been shot, Noah couldn't help but remember his friend telling him he had his grandfather's gun. For protection, he had said. But then Riley asked if he knew how to get fingerprints off a gun. He claimed he was asking for his roommate. He didn't believe that story any more than he believed Riley had really been kidnapped, so he called the cops. Imagine being in his shoes. If your friend came to you and you thought they might have just committed a murder, what would you do? Well, the detectives asked Noah and another one of their friends, Alex, for their help to get Riley to confess. They asked if they'd be willing to offer to help take care of the gun. Take care as in, get rid of it for him. So the detectives needed to get their hands on that murder weapon, but they also wanted to get proof that the gun was in Riley's possession. So they couldn't exactly just go over to his apartment and be like, "Hey, give me that gun, brother. I'll get rid of that for you." No, the cops really wanted to see Riley holding the murder weapon, the smoking gun, literally. So they upped the stakes even more by asking the two guys if they'd be willing to wear a wire. Not only were they then placing these two innocent kids in a car with a possible, definitely murderer, they were hoping that the murderer was going to have a gun with him. The situation they were putting them in was so dangerous, but these guys did not scare easily. They agreed to it, and the cops set it up so there would be listening devices in both the car and in Alex's sleeves. They also put a camera in the key fob for the car. The day she died, Riley flooded his social media with these loving memorials to Emma. Right, listen to this one. "Rest easy now, sweetheart. 1 Corinthians 13:8. Be sure to remind God about our verse. I love you forever and always." The next night, he went over to Noah's house. So Noah and Alex were hoping that the guilt of the whole thing would make Riley confess fast so the cops could swarm in and the whole thing would finally be over. But that didn't happen. He stuck to his story. He insisted he didn't murder Emma, but he was smart enough to realize he was the prime suspect, so he wanted to throw the gun in the river. Now, without a confession or seeing the gun in Riley's hands, these guys had no choice. The three of them headed out. The detectives tried to follow without being seen, but then they lost them. They lost sight of the vehicle. They lost connection with the wires and the listening devices. They had no idea where the boys had gone. Well, they had just gone for chili cheese fries. Like one last chance to try and convince Riley to give them the gun, talk about the murder, get it all on tape. And it worked. After they ate, they went to an apartment where Riley thought they would be safe. And that's where he pulled the murder weapon out of a garbage bag. And once he had the gun in his hands, Alex texted the prearranged code word to the police and waited. Minutes ticked by, and the boys were starting to get worried. They stalled for time. They're wondering, what is going on? Is help coming? They didn't know that their pit stop for fries had put a dent in the entire sting operation. But finally, just as they thought they would have to go along with his plan to throw the gun in the river, the police surrounded the car, and Riley was arrested. In 2018, he went on trial for her murder, and everything seemed so straightforward in the case. The gun was in Riley's possession. His controlling, manipulative antics toward Emma were witnessed by several people. There were so many witnesses to his years of emotional abuse toward her, they had like an embarrassing wealth of witnesses. It was all there, but his defense attorney wanted the jury to find him guilty of reckless homicide, not murder in the first degree, because Riley was claiming he didn't plan on killing her. He just wanted to scare her by shooting into her room. He thought if he shot into the wall from outside, he wouldn't hit her, that it would just ricochet around the room and she would be scared enough to call him again. But what were the odds that he would shoot in just the right spot? That he would shoot through the wall and hit her in the head. After all, he'd been in her house before. He'd been in her room before. He knew where and how she slept. 4 hours after the jury was dismissed to deliberate on his fate, they came back with a guilty verdict. He was sentenced to life in prison, and he'll be eligible for parole when he's in his 70s.